evening. Thank you so much for joining us for our CPD session today in Modern Foreign Languages. We are delighted to welcome again William Law of Tunbridge School. He is one of our lead setters for French. The aim of these sessions is to support you delivering the new specifications for CE, with this session focusing on integrating equity, diversity and inclusion into teaching and learning and developing vocab, grammar, receptive and productive skills in modern languages. Our aim at ISEB is to improve our assessments at every opportunity. So in our next session with Will, which will be happening in June, so do join us for that one. Hopefully you will enjoy what you see today. We'll be reflecting on the first year of teaching the new specification as well. So do sign up on Eventbrite for our next session in MFL, which is on June the 20th. And I know that there's currently an early bird discount if you book soon. It's also a reminder that ISEB has finally joined social media, and you will be able to join us, chat to us, share your experiences, and start to have a dialogue with us at ISEB Awards on all channels. So once William's session's finished, there will be time for questions, of course, and I've already got some here that you guys have sent in earlier, so thank you for that. Please use the chat function in YouTube to pose any questions, whether that's after the session or during the session. Just a reminder, you need to be logged into either Google or YouTube to be able to do that. So if you're trying to post a question and it's not working, it's just a reminder to log into Google or YouTube and you will get that chat function ready. I will be making a note of your questions and we will make sure that all of those are answered in our Q&A later. But without much further ado, I am delighted to hand you over to Will.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, and welcome from me too. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to you this afternoon after what I know is a long and busy day at school and at a hectic point in the term. But I hope this seminar provides some food for thought and perhaps some helpful advice and encouragement too. You might hear that I'm joined by our 15-week-old miniature Dachshund who's just in the kitchen now. She's going to be taken out very, very shortly when my partner gets home. She's not in here with me because she didn't get on the tickets in time, I'm afraid. But apologies for any background noise you can hear there. We'll get rid of that in just a moment. So yes, my name is Will Law. I'm head of languages and head of French at Tunbridge School in Kent. And I've been part of the ISEB languages setting team for 5 years now. I used to teach in an all-through school, and I loved in particular the energy and enthusiasm of my years 5, 6, 7 and 8 language classes. But now one step removed from all of that, and I suppose wearing both my senior school teacher and my ISEB examiner hats as I am now, it's even clearer for me to see just how vital the role of the prep school language teacher is in developing strong linguistic foundations for learners, and perhaps just as importantly, instilling curiosity and wonder in the world around them. In most cases, as well you know, students' language learning journeys start in your classroom, and that's an incredible privilege. And here at ISEB, we want to help you do the best job you can by providing you with a rigorous and relevant specification to follow, and assessments that allow your students to demonstrate what they've learned competently, confidently, and creatively too. As Julia's just said, this is the second one of the CPD sessions I've run for ISEB. You can find a recording of last May's Twilight session in which we ran through our exciting new spec and gave a detailed and comprehensive overview of our revamped assessment structure in modern languages. And that's on the ISEB YouTube channel. And as Julia's just said, in the summer, we'll be running a session entitled Lessons for Year 2, Preparation for the Second Year Teaching of the new ISEB 13+ Common Entrance Modern Languages Specification. It is the hottest ticket in town after Hamilton, and you can find out more on the ISEB website. So today's session then, building on the last, focuses more on maximising your and your students' potential. The 3 areas we're going to cover might look quite disparate, though in fact they are interrelated. Firstly, we're going to be talking about EDI in the modern languages classroom, and specifically in the context of our qualifications. We're then going to move on to looking at approaches to developing vocabulary, grammar, receptive and productive skills during the teaching of our specification itself, and also such that the final assessment that your candidates sit represents an authentic and natural culmination of 2 years' study and serves as a springboard for future success in the subject. And then in the final section of today's session, we're going to be thinking about some of your reflections on teaching the first year of our new course. This section, I hasten to add, is entirely driven by you, the comments or questions you've submitted in advance of this session and indeed during it, or that have come through our head office in recent months. Okay, let's get to it. And then to start with, equality, diversion and inclusion. Now, you might be asking yourself why we're dedicating a whole chunk of today's session to talking about this. And for us, the answer is really simple. As an organisation that fundamentally holds a great deal of power over what our young people learn and how in turn they use those knowledge and skills, we believe it's absolutely crucial that everything we do is underpinned by a system of values that shape and support and sustain our key principles. And of course, as we know, as subject specialists, modern languages is not a static subject, and thank goodness for that. It's one of the things, after all, that makes it so fun to teach. And just as language itself evolves over time, so the world changes. And as a language setting team, we've come to identify two guiding principles. Our qualifications and assessments should reflect the world around us, and they should also encourage respect of ourselves, of each other, and of our local and global communities. Representation is really important. And one of the very things that makes this subject so interesting is the opportunity it has to introduce students to new places, to new people and ideas. But we're doing ourselves and you and your students a disservice if we take a blinkered or overly simplistic approach to this. It's not the case that the French-speaking world, or at least the whole of it, can be represented by Jacques, the cheese-eating, Breton stripe-wearing Parisian cyclist, or the whole of the Spanish-speaking world by a sunny holiday on the Costa del Sol. Difference and cultural diversity and celebrating it is really important. As suggested in the Twilight session last May, make an effort in your classrooms and departments to represent the fullness of the French, German, or Spanish-speaking worlds. One idea, for example, that you might want to explore is matching the teaching of a particular topic or component with an appropriate cultural issue. The topic of, say, holidays in French explored through a visit over a unit of teaching to Quebec, transport or food in German through an immersive approach that seeks to get under the skin of life in a particular city or region where that language is spoken. We're also acutely aware of our responsibility as a leading exam board to reflect the diversity of experience amongst our own candidates. Not all of our candidates, after all, across many different countries, celebrate the same festivals, or can be relied upon to have studied the same subjects or topics in school, and so don't have the same cultural bearings. To give you an idea of some of the detail here, one of the setters on the team I'm part of pointed out recently that in the past we frequently used the icon of a lamb in a field to represent the notion of spring in listening, reading and writing papers, for example. However, for lots of our candidates, this association is nonsensical. These sorts of things might seem trivial and unimportant, but of course they do really matter if you're one of those candidates. Now, as we seek to reflect the world around us, authenticity is extremely important to us. We don't want to fall into perpetuating stereotypes, but rather challenge them. Equally, we also don't want to be gratuitous in our pursuit of representation. Our lens is becoming deliberately wider. Stendhal talked about the novel as being a miroir qui se promène sur une grande route, a mirror walking along a main road, reflecting everything it comes across. And that's perhaps a good aspiration for all of us too. Nonetheless, there are certain things that this miroir won't reflect because we're conscious of our candidates' age and stage of development. It would be inappropriate, for example, to confront candidates with reading passages or listening questions that contain overt political commentary. And explorations of important issues such as racism or gender equality are best left as they are to IGCSE or even A-level courses. But you can expect to find increasingly, for example, implicit validation of diversity and inclusion at a level appropriate to and as experienced by our candidates to be reflected in our assessments. Not all families are nuclear, for example. In a listening test, Monique's parents might be divorced, or she might have 2 mums or 2 dads. In a reading test, Greta might struggle with reading or writing at school, surely a reality for lots of our students, but find validation in creative expression instead. Jonas might not like playing football with the other boys in class, but rather enjoy dance or art. We know, and we're excited by the fact that we have a real opportunity to set high standards here, because it's through our specification that students will be formally introduced for the first time to some of these issues. Now, as well as reflecting these differences, we want to encourage respect towards them. Interacting with the other, the foreign, in inverted commas, is, after all, what we do. In fact, we're the experts in it. Put simply, if a student themselves don't identify or have experience of a particular concept, for example, a single parent family as represented in a text, then they should be prepared to acknowledge, examine, and at the very least, tolerate it. By encouraging increased focus on and featuring diverse approaches to self and social organization, we hope that such experiences become legitimized. On a practical level, do consider the fact that even relatively prosaic topics can be enhanced or enlivened by an approach that seeks to draw out an aspect of comparative cultural interest. Why is a French child's school day or daily routine different to mine? And what are the relative advantages and disadvantages of each? Why is a particular festival celebrated in South America, but not so much here in the UK? There's also a great deal of fun to be had in doing so. In fact, we all know that some of our best moments in the classroom have been when students' minds have been blown by an aspect of the target language, culture, or society that seems so alien or intangible to us. So where do opportunities exist to really exploit this? Well, the slide you can see on the screen now gives just a brief selection of topics where there's scope for productive convergence between some of the ideas we've been discussing and their practical usage in the classroom. Don't forget that we have perhaps an unusually personal relationship with our students, which provides very fertile ground for explorations of lots of these topics. The so-called hidden curriculum of modern languages is all about seeking to understand why difference matters, and in doing so, exploring one's own place in the world. And on a more sort of meta level, it's worth thinking that every time we use language, we're involving ourselves in a transaction or a relationship of sorts. In our role plays, for example, we ask candidates to communicate in a culturally sensitive and clear way to resolve issues or reach solutions. In doing so, we're attempting to impart a sense that your place in the world, as an individual and as part of a global community, matters. Just as EDI is something that we hope you'll be conscious of in your classroom, so our assessments will reflect its importance too. EDI isn't something that we'll deal with gratuitously in the context of our assessments. It's not just a case of including a reading text set in French-speaking Canada and being done with it. We're giving careful thought as to how the same principles we've just been talking about will come across in the exams we set, such that candidates are encouraged, even in the exam hall, to engage with difference. Finally, on EDI, I thought I'd quickly talk about access to the assessments themselves, because we get a lot of questions about this. We know that modern languages presents some very specific issues, especially for students with special or enhanced educational needs. For example, students with hearing loss facing a listening exam, students with profound dyslexia attempting an exam where accuracy in spelling and grammar are rewarded. Fundamentally, of course, we want our assessments to be accessible to all. Part of our long and rigorous moderation process for exams involves careful reviewing and checking of papers to ensure that instructions are as clear as possible, questions are as uncluttered as possible, and the most direct and straightforward language has been used to get ideas across. For example, in our recent round of reviewing for the 2023 to 24 series of French papers, we made some changes to various questions in the listening and reading papers to ensure that the prompts were as specific as possible and reduce the burden on candidates to process long chunks of text in the rubrics at the expense of focusing on what really matters, the questions and their answers. Elsewhere, the ability to use a dictionary in preparation for the speaking exam is intended in part to be a leveler, to ensure that in a qualification that doesn't have an official vocab list, no candidate is disadvantaged. It also allows us to be a bit more creative with the types of questions we set, and proficient use of a paper dictionary is, in and of itself, a skill that's worth developing. If you have any questions about particular candidates of yours, please do liaise with the appropriate senior school or our head office. As a senior school head of department, I can tell you now that it's in everyone's best interests to ensure every candidate is able to do as well as they possibly can in any assessment. Right, now we're going to move on to the second part of this session, which focuses on developing vocabulary, grammar, receptive and productive skills. Our new syllabus and assessment structure requires some new and specific skills. And if you'd like any reminders about any of this, then do please access our Twilight CPD session from May 2021, which is available on YouTube via the ISEB's channel. In this section, I'm going to review the place that each of vocabulary, grammar, receptive and productive skills has in our qualifications, and provide a selection of practical tips, including where appropriate, some examples of activities to help introduce, practice or consolidate them. I'll occasionally be referencing some specific activities developed by Gianfranco Conti, who delivered some CPD for ISEB back in 2018. So let's start by looking at vocab. There's still no prescribed vocab list for CE languages. Part of our rationale is that we don't want to limit ourselves or you. In a subject where so much differentiation is possible and sometimes required, we feel that limiting you to a specific pre-identified set of words isn't helpful. And whilst we know there's comfort in the familiar, in the anticipatable, we're also aware that a prescribed vocab list adds a certain amount of pressure for schools and for candidates. Our approach is rather to do two things. Firstly, give you some autonomy in the way that you'd like to teach and build up your students' vocabulary. And secondly, encourage students to be able to deal with the unknown, understanding how to recognize the emphasis or balance of a sentence, and so determine, for example, that the word that they haven't yet encountered must be, for example, a positive adjective or a type of clothing. This, of course, reflects the way in which vocab is assessed in our exams, both through direct recognition, pull vert being a green jumper, but also through context and inference. For example, if il pleut, then it wouldn't be a good idea to book a seat en terrasse at the restaurant. Nonetheless, our assessments are not designed to be a vocab test, and we want to be really emphatic about this. And in fact, just like in the real world, it's absolutely possible, indeed desirable, for candidates to make a success of them without fretting over every word or phrase. Understanding how language works, how those vocab parts come together to form a sensical whole, is much more important for us. So how can you maneuver your candidates into a position where they're able to do this? Because it might seem like a big ask. Well, our first recommendation is to move from working at an individual word level to dealing with chunks of language as soon as possible. You might already work with sentence builders or the like, which are designed to help students of language produce meaningful chunks of language as easily as possible. A bit like those sort of flip books that children enjoy playing with, where, for example, you can dress someone up with the head of a policeman and the body of a ballet dancer and the feet of a dinosaur and chop and change with lots of different possible outcomes. Sentence builders offer choice and freedom whilst offering a specific framework for the context of the utterance. They're excellent at helping students see how individual words can be knitted together. And used well, students quickly become used to spotting patterns like adjective or adverb placement. Whilst they might seem initially constrictive, with a finite amount of sentences being ultimately possible, they encourage an approach that puts emphasis on manipulation of language. Students quickly come to understand how they can, for example, swap out an adjective for another, or add in or take out a negative to change the meaning of a sentence. In the context of an activity like our role plays, they're also very good at drilling particular specific chunks of language that should become second nature to students. For example, est-ce que je peux avoir? plus an article plus a noun, or me gustaría plus a noun. Another way of increasing student spontaneity with vocab is to work with families of words. Spend time understanding how words are constructed in different languages. The ending of a noun in French, for example, as the doer of a verb. Negative prefixes, diminutive suffixes. Try and make sure your students can transform items of vocab across word categories, turning a noun into an adjective or into a verb, for example. Encourage students too to see common roots across word families, for example in French, mer, marin, and maritime. It's also important to get plenty of practice doing what I've called here working around words. The basis indeed of so many of our receptive tasks is spotting how similar ideas are expressed in source texts and then in the questions that accompany them, including using negatives or antonyms. For example, a hotel described as pas loin de la plage in a text would equate to one described as au bord de la mer in a question. Don't neglect the importance of working with words orally and visually too. There's plenty of fun to be had chanting, identifying sound patterns, even resurrecting the lost art of dictation to make sure that students are dotting their I's and crossing their T's. Insisting on precision and accuracy in use of vocab will bear fruit. Do test your students' knowledge regularly, but the old-fashioned vocab test doesn't have to be the only way of doing so. Faulty translations, for example, a source text translated mostly correctly, but with some errors with individual items of vocab, are a fun and simple idea, and they can work both ways. Similarly, structured productive tasks that require the use of particular words in particular forms, for example, the feminine plural form of an adjective, or a particular verb in a particular tense, will also help students put their knowledge of vocab into practice. Grammar and vocab do in many ways go hand in hand. The former could be described as the sort of cement that sticks the latter together and creates something concrete and tangible out of it. In our assessments, it's assessed explicitly, gosh, that's difficult after a 7-period day, in productive tasks, but recognition of discrete grammatical items, for example, the tense or person of a verb, or a negative construction, is often the key to unlocking an answer in a reading or listening question. We recommend that you teach grammar in context, and don't be afraid to use the proper terminology to do so. It is useful, fundamentally, if your students know what terms like pronoun, infinitive, or past participle mean. A spiral approach within your curriculum is something to consider, because lots of grammar points reinforce each other. For example, if you teach the passé composé in French a year or so after you've taught the present tense, you might well find that you need to start by reinforcing the present tense of être and avoir, so those auxiliary verbs come quicker. Start combining taught and items being learned together as soon as possible, especially when it comes to tenses, so that students can see that they don't exist in isolation, rather that they interact. Get students into the habit early on of creating simple sentences with at least 2 tenses and an appropriate time marker to switch the time frame. Normalmente voy al cine, pero la semana pasada fui al centro comercial. Don't teach grammar in isolation from other skills either. Students must use grammar, and vocab too for that matter, or they'll lose it. Again, structured productive tasks that require the use of particular items can force certain issues. For example, the need to understand and differentiate between passé composé verbs that use être with an agreement versus those that use avoir without one. Text transformations work well for targeting specific issues. For example, providing a source text written from a masculine perspective that must be transformed into the feminine perspective, or from one tense into another. Grammar gap fill tasks, where infinitives of verbs or masculine singular base forms of adjectives are provided, and students must work out the correct conjugation or transformation from the context, provided a good preparation for both writing and the explicit grammar translation sentence component of the Level 2 tests. And don't forget that just as important as producing accurate and grammatically fluent language is being able to recognize how grammar works in written and spoken texts. For example, multi-tense texts. Let's say one that describes what a person used to do on holiday, does now, and will do in the future, and from which the students must extract the different activities and categorize them according to their time frame, can help students see how different tenses interact. Let's move on then to receptive skills, which refer, of course, to how we receive and subsequently interpret language, i.e. by reading and listening. Now, we test receptive skills in a number of ways, and not just through pure short answer comprehension questions. Candidates in our exams might be required to match statements to people, identify true or false sentences, order statements according to the order in which they appear in a text, or answer multiple choice questions. As well as the different exercises that they might be asked to perform, you might also like to think about the angle or approach needed in a particular task. Some tasks require reading for gist, i.e. skim reading, to extract particular pieces of information. This might be the case, for example, if candidates are presented with 3 different menus and they must decide which one would be appropriate for a person with a given requirement, like a like or dislike of a particular food or a special diet. Others might require reading for depth, where more of a focus on chronology, sequencing, and detail is required. Sometimes questions will require the spotting or simple recognition of language items, sometimes more complicatedly, inference or interpretation. Whatever the type of task, I think the key here is to start with some reassurance. It's not necessary for your students to know every single word to succeed in a receptive task. Start nonetheless with comprehensible input. There's little use in flooding texts with masses of unknown vocab, which will only put students off. Small, simple texts that recycle recently learned vocab and grammatical structures will give students a sense of achievement. Narrow tasks, for example, that encourage students to spot the difference between texts, or faulty translations, as mentioned before, are good for drilling into detail, and productive tasks can be born out of such receptive tasks too. When dealing with longer exam-style text, remember the importance of anticipation, or pre-listening and pre-reading, eliciting clues from images, titles, headings, numbers, and so on. And not to mention, of course, reading the questions to help orientate oneself in the passage. We'd encourage the use of authentic sources adapted to an appropriate level where possible, for example, from websites or from magazines. They'll not only help students feel a sense of achievement and pleasure at interacting with real material, but they're also second to none for genuine cultural enrichment. Don't ignore audio-visual resources too. Simple cartoons, even things like adverts with or without subtitles can all be useful, especially because of the visual cues that they include. And finally, in this section, productive tasks. Now, the only genuinely open-ended productive task in our portfolio is the general conversation part of the speaking exam. All of the others, including the level 2 writing, where prompts are provided, are structured tasks with prompts to guide the candidate towards an appropriate response. Needless to say, these are given for a reason, and there's lots of profitable work to be got out of analysing and brainstorming prompts to explore possible interpretations. And this can be done very profitably as a class. I would really emphasise the control that students have in the productive skills element of our assessments. As I often say to the boys that I teach, this is an area where, as long as you're sticking to the topic, you can decide what to write or what to say. Now, that's potentially daunting, but it's also very empowering. Not sure how to say something? Then find another way that works for you. There's definitely an element of anticipation here too. It's easy to dismiss these tasks as unpreparable for, because faute de savoir exactly what's going to come up in the test, it can be futile to try and do anything other than practice lots of titles on different topics and hope for the best. However, encouraging students to develop a repertoire, a writing or speaking portfolio with their favorite phrases is definitely a good idea. For example, you can be pretty much guaranteed that at some point, whether in the writing or speaking, you'll have cause to describe someone. So have some set phrases for doing that you can easily adapt to the particular context of the actual task. However, this does come with a caveat. One of the mantras from the previous Twilight session I hosted was do less, but do it well. Using complex GCSE or A-level grammar, subjunctives and the like, can be impressive if used well, but in our experience, they rarely are. And it can even lead to longer-term confusion for the learner if such expressions are rote learned without context. I've certainly taught Year 9 boys who can whip out a subjunctive or two on demand, but whose knowledge of the present tense is shaky. They can't explain to me how to come about the former. And in any case, I'm more interested at this stage in their competence in the latter. In terms of preparation, lots of structured production, including translation, is a good place to start. Writing grids, pyramid translations, trapdoor speaking, all of which encourage the repetition and consolidation of key grammar points and their eventual transformation into longer sensical chunks are important. But rote learning of long sequences of language at the expense of being genuinely able to manipulate language should be avoided. Learn templates rather than specific examples. For example, past time frame, I past verbed, but present time frame, I now verb. Accuracy, and in the case of speaking, pronunciation are important, but that need not be daunting for candidates or their teachers. In the case of the latter, plenty of modelling from the teacher is important. Students should be aspirational too about and take pride in improving their accent. Now, in this third and final part of the session, it is really over to you. We wanted to dedicate some time to reflecting on your experiences of teaching the first year of the course. And lots of you have shared questions or comments with us in advance, which we're really grateful for. There's also, I believe, an opportunity to do so here live now. And I think Julia's been amassing a good bank of these questions for us. I think she's going to play question master, and I'm going to be sitting in the big black mastermind chair. So, Julia, what questions have we got for us?
Well, we have an awful lot, Will, so I hope you're ready. I think the glasses may have been necessary.
They fogged up a little bit. I'm sorry about that.
Winnie needs to come in and answer some herself as well. I thought she was excellent too. But let's start with one directly from the audience and sent earlier, which was, and in fact, you sort of just covered it, but let's do it anyway. You advised in a previous presentation that we should cover less with pupils, but do it better. This doesn't help with certain schools who mark the CE papers according to their own (brackets stringent) criteria, however. We would really appreciate your thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's a really difficult one, isn't it? And it's one of the features of our assessment that it's very difficult to find a solution for. The fact that obviously there's no central moderation of candidate scripts when they're sent to senior schools. I think the point stands though, and certainly from my perspective as a head of department in a senior school, my fundamental interest and what allows and enables me to subsequently do interesting things with, in my case here in Tunbridge, with the boys that I teach, is students that have a solid foundation, and that's the most important thing to work on. We do advise, and I hope our new specification is useful in this respect. We do. We are hoping that we are giving, we're hoping that reduced content and a more obvious and instinctive approach to assessment will allow teachers and departments at prep schools to really focus in on some of the skills that we've been talking about today and some of those that we mentioned in our previous Twilight CPD. And really, and particularly given the context of the last couple of years when face-to-face teaching has been rarer than we would like it to be, if you are able to produce candidates, send candidates to us who are able to communicate simply but confidently and accurately, that's really, really important. We do also provide, of course, instructions and examples to senior schools to guide them in terms of what they should be rewarding when they mark these papers too. So do be reassured by that. But I would be surprised if any senior school is looking for flashy flourishes of language at the expense of detailed, deep, and rigorous understanding of key content.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that. It's a very good answer. So we have another one, which is for the speaking section. This is broken into 3 parts.
Yeah.
A, is there a list of suggested questions for the topics in theme A?
Do you want me to answer it by part? Is that easy, do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to do it by
Okay,
part.
super.
Question A,
Yeah.
is there a list of suggested questions for topics in theme A?
We don't provide one, partly for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier, which is that we'd like to give you some autonomy in terms of the way in which you structure your course, the aspects of particular themes that you would like to focus on, obviously within the broader content as defined in our specification. So no, we don't produce technically a list of questions, although schools can be guided, for example, by the sorts of things that we produce, by the sorts of questions that we produce for our other productive tasks. So, for example, in our writing questions. We think there's lots of opportunity, though, for, and this is where thinking carefully about how you as a teacher or examiner approach these tasks is important. We think there's real opportunity for differentiation in the speaking exam, and that's another reason why we're keen not to sort of box you in with a sort of prescribed list of questions, because we would like you to have the opportunity to push very able candidates further, also to support perhaps weaker candidates in a task that obviously, because of the particular context they find difficult.
Lovely. And so part B, in the open conversations, roughly how many questions should be asked and over how many topics?
So that's a really good question. I think, again, in a sense, some of what I've just said is relevant there. There will be students who are very happy, nattering away for 30 seconds on a particular question or on a particular topic, and that's absolutely fine. But do equally give them the opportunity to sort of sortir des chemins battus, to sort of go off the beaten track a little bit. Try to encourage students to stray away from sort of rote learning, long answers. Because ultimately we do like to see that they can think on their feet in this task too, and that's really important. So we're not going to put a number on it and say that you should be asking 4 questions, 6 questions, 10 questions. Any of those numbers would be suitable for particular candidates given their own experiences or the way in which they can access the test. But what we would say is make sure that your questions give candidates an opportunity to demonstrate the range of what they know. And there are lots of different ways of thinking about this. One, with my sort of IGCSE examining hat on, is to try and ask questions with sort of different levels of openness, if that makes sense. So, for example, to ease candidates in at the start of a speaking exam when they're nervous, you might like to ask them, for example, to simply describe something, which essentially involves really a list of vocab or simple ideas that they can piece together with simple connectives. But questions might open out subsequently to ask what they think about something, or their impressions or opinions of a particular thing. And actually, if candidates are able to do that, even simply here, and I don't want you to think we're being sort of overambitious about this, we're talking about simple words of expression, giving qualities and qualifications to things, then actually that does demonstrate on their part flexibility in terms of the way that they can think on their feet, but also show off their language. We also would really like to see your best candidates speak in 3 tenses where possible, in the present, in the past, and in the future. And again, questions that encourage them to do so are really welcome, and might be best placed, for example, towards the end of the exam. A question that asks a candidate, for example, to describe what they did last year on holiday compared to this year, for example. And again, that can be answered in 2 or 3 very simple sentences, one in the past tense, one in the present tense, but it shows mental agility and flexibility, linguistic flexibility on the part of a candidate, and that's really impressive to us who listen to those exams.
Brilliant. So finally, are you ready? Regarding the difference between levels 1 and 2, other than the role play, is the differentiation only by outcome?
So that's a really good question. I think, again, to sort of pick up on something that I've just said, I think you as the teacher or examiner have a really important role to play here. You know your candidates, and part of your role is to put them at ease in the context of these assessments of a stressful assessment that is the speaking exam. But also the types of questions that you ask are vital in terms of allowing candidates to display rather differentiation amongst your range of candidates. So again, thinking carefully about question types, thinking carefully about the angle that you want to approach with a particular with particular candidates, or a particular candidate with a particular profile, is really important. It is worth saying that the text-based task we've introduced for the speaking exam is slightly more complex at level 2, in that there's a little bit more information for them to communicate. So there are more sort of prompts given, and slightly more detailed answers are required there too. But no, fundamentally, I think this is a really exciting component of the exam, because actually it is the acid test of how students are able to cope in an unprepared, fundamentally, but supportive, thanks to you, communicative context.
Brilliant. And actually, just because it's great to learn something new, you demonstrated the French phrase for "off the beaten track." What was that again?
I think there'll probably be someone watching who can.
We'll encourage participation.
I think it's sortir. I think they use either sentier or chemin. I can't remember actually off the top of my head. I think it's sortir des sentiers or des chemins battus. Someone will probably write in, I'm sure, to tell me to tell me which one it is off the top of my head. It's an expression that our language assistant used to use a lot, and we love, do you know what, a little flourish like that that's been learnt, rehearsed, and can be included. Particularly, in fact, might I anticipate something that I'm sure people have got questions about, which is an element of this sort of text-based task. And one of the things that I know we've got lots of questions about is, and while we're on the speaking, is the extent to which candidates are required to show spontaneity in that task.
Yeah.
Because there is provision in the mark scheme for candidates' engagement with that task beyond the confines of the information they're actually given. So just to remind you of that, essentially there's a context that's given, for example, let's say a school exchange visit to Nice, and there's particular details like the time that it happens, the mode of transport, and there's, there we go. Merci. Des chantiers battus. Voilà, très bien. There's particular transport times, clothing, and so on given. And of course, essentially, the idea is that the students have to listen carefully to the questions that the examiner is asking, and they have to respond to provide the required information. But we do want candidates to engage a little bit beyond that and show us that they can be a little bit more creative, and that might include something as simple as, for example, adding a brief opinion about something. So, for example, let's say on a school trip, they're going to explain that they're going to go to a museum or they're going to go shopping. They might add something like, "That's fantastic," or "How wonderful," or "I can't wait," or something like that. They might add in an adjective that we hadn't provided with them with to describe, for example, an animal or a place, like noisy or barky, to describe Willie in the first half of that presentation, for example. And that sort of thing is actually really important, because that, of course, reflects the way in which actually we use language. And we're really excited about this task because we think it models, as closely as we fundamentally can within an assessment context, both a sense of anticipation, insofar as if as a young person you're going to go into an ice cream parlor or a restaurant and order for something, you will have thought about what it is that you want to say. But of course, conversation and interaction and dialogue brings up unexpected things too, and we want them to be able to be prepared for that and learn how to respond to such things.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Gloria's just given us a more commonly used expression as well. So brilliant. See, look, we're all learning today, and this is why it's the hottest ticket in town.
Gloria should be doing this instead of me, I think, this afternoon. That's what I think.
Well, I think we should get everyone online. I think it's wonderful. But I now have some other questions. Oh, okay. I think what we should just do is put Will on the spot at any available opportunity. What exam skills should I introduce and when?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, how long have you got? There's
Yes.
one of the things that I think is really important to say is that this is much more than an exam. This is about fundamentally instilling a love for and an interest in and a curiosity about languages. And I don't want to sort of be so dismissive as to say that the exam should be incidental, although it is, of course, the case that if students are clever and confident and competent linguists in and of themselves, then there's very little in our assessments that should really shock them. If they can write simple and accurate French or German or Spanish, enjoy having conversations with their teachers, understand simple text and so on. But nonetheless, of course, it's absolutely right that you should be giving thought to what it is that you want to introduce when. I think really the most important thing to think about is ensuring that before you introduce any type of what we might call an authentic sort of exam task, like one of our writing essays, or for example, like our text-based task in the speaking, where they're required to produce language, they're already able to manage and manipulate things like at least 2 tenses, and they're able to provide opinions and evaluations of things. Otherwise, actually, there's very little that can be got out of practicing thoroughly those tasks, because that's a fundamental requirement of them. Or something that we expect to see amongst our best candidates. In terms of things like longer reading and listening tasks, again, so that we don't scare or put candidates off, they obviously need to, they need to have no small amount of experience, having immersed themselves in the language, having taken time to build up and develop a broad range of vocabulary, having started to understand how grammar sticks all of that together before they can tackle a long passage in French or German or Spanish. And again, we don't want that to be a daunting thing for them. We want this to be something that they think that they can access and that they take pleasure in trying to decipher. I think, I don't want to sort of suggest that this is the answer, but perhaps an approach to this might be to leave some of those more complex tasks, like the text-based task, like the longer essay, to essentially the final academic year of teaching prior to this qualification. Because we want the students to do them well, and we want them to approach those tasks with enough tools in their linguistic toolkit to be able to enjoy and make the most of them. But actually, fundamentally, everything that they end up having to do in one of our assessments, right from day one, is being, is being sort of developed and built up within them. So concentrate on, as it were, getting the basics right. Make sure that vocabulary is being built. Make sure that students are able to manipulate and play with language. Make sure they can express themselves clearly and accurately. And then apply that to the way in which we want to assess these students. There's no point, putting an exam paper in front of them in year 6 and saying, yeah, this is where we want you to be in 2 years' time. Because partly that takes some of the joy and discovery and interest out of the process, and because of the nature of our assessment with its different components and in a sense some of its unpredictability, that can be quite daunting. But equally, you as a teacher will have in mind the end result. You'll know where you want to get with your candidates, and it is true that certain features of our assessment, like for example being able to distinguish positive opinions and negative opinions, positive statements, negative statements, dealing with chronology and ordering ideas in text, will fundamentally be things that are covered well before you start applying them in the assessment context.
Lovely. Thank you very much. So, well, how about this one? Oh, there's two really good ones. I'm torn. So let's start with, is structuring teaching by topic still appropriate?
This is a really relevant question because, of course, these things are under discussion at GCSE level at the moment. Too, and actually, it's probably worth colleagues here online, if they haven't already, checking out some of the recent what's recently been published and said about some of those changes that your students will be encountering, obviously in a few years' time too. I think certainly teaching by topic can be a useful starting point, a way in which to ground fundamentally what will be disparate ideas in sensical groups, and indeed the way in which we structure our syllabus requires it to an extent, because there is a checklist of topics and languages that need to be covered. That said, if and when possible, we think there's also a great deal to be got out of combining those topics and creating links between them. We certainly don't want to sort of foster an approach where the only things that students are ever able to say about themselves are the 4 or 5 specific topics that they might have learned in that particular term. And it's certainly the case also that in our assessments, both in our writing and in our text-based tasks, in the speaking and in the general conversation too, but also in our listening and reading exams, we don't just have questions that focus on one particular topic. Texts, for example, that we write on our reading exams will include, a little bit of vocab from say talking about our town, but they might combine it with numbers or colours or, for example, information about chores or weather, for example. So candidates do need to be flexible enough to be able to see how those different topics interact, and that's a really important thing. So yes, a useful starting point certainly, but do encourage comparison across topics. Do encourage them to be able to, as soon as possible, and particularly as they approach the exam, to combine vocabulary and structures that they've learned associated with different topic areas together. I think one thing that it's also just very briefly important to say is that there's a real danger, for example, when teaching grammar, that is anchored to or relied very strongly to particular topics. There's always a danger, of course, that the only way that students then know how to use that is when they're talking about those particular things. So a really common example from my own teaching, or from the way that we structure a course here at Tunbridge, is that we introduce the subjunctive to our GCSE students when they're learning the environment. And of course, therefore, they can produce all these wonderful phrases using the subjunctive when they're talking about the environment. But actually, if you then ask them to retrospectively apply that to other topics they've learned, they don't always find it very easy. So we make a real point of trying to teach grammar, particularly in a way that encompasses as many different things as possible, uses different words, uses different phrases and structures and so on.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point, actually. Yeah, I think I'd be really, really good at ordering things in a restaurant, but were I to have to sort of order something in any other context in a language, I really would not be good. So
then you need to do the common entrance French or German or Spanish course,
and recommend that to all my friends. And absolutely, well, I love it. Je t'aime, in fact. Here was my second favorite question, the one with which I was torn, which is, will you use authentic sources in your listening and reading papers? I thought it was a good question.
It's a really good question, and we are definitely open to the idea. One of my jobs is writing some of the reading questions for the Common Entrance French exam. And it's an attractive option, partly because, of course, for me to, invent so many different things is a bit of a challenge sometimes. And I also don't want it to be always my voice as someone with particular experience and life experience and so on coming through in these texts. So yeah, we certainly at the very least take inspiration from things that we might see in the news, things that we might read in magazines, including on things like, in my case in French, from French websites, that are aimed at young people or teenagers, like Phosphor, for example, and often, the inspiration for a particular text, even if it's not that I'm lifting it directly from there, will come from something like that. However, actually, it is the case that sometimes we do, take some paragraphs or a short chunk of text from a real story. Rest assured, though, that when we do that, it will always be something that is appropriate. There's plenty in the news, for example, at the moment that wouldn't be appropriate for us to pull and use in a paper designed for 12 or 13-year-olds. Equally, we will always adapt language so that it corresponds to what we expect students to have achieved. So we're not going to, pull a really fancy passage from something and leave it in there. We tailor and doctor it, sometimes even, beyond recognition, so that the core message is there or the core ideas are there, but that subsequently and fundamentally students are able to access it. So again, that's not something for you as teachers to be worried about. You don't sort of need to think, gosh, my students can't read a newspaper in French, or they can't watch the news in French. They, in many senses, they shouldn't be able to at this age. If they can, that's fantastic. You're doing an amazing job. But we're not going to be requiring them to, read editorials from Le Monde or whatever it might be. But certainly, yeah, we take inspiration from, and sometimes directly language from, such sources, and partly too in the context of what we were talking about earlier, because we feel that actually that's a really interesting thing, and what a sense of achievement, right, for students to feel that actually they have accessed something that's genuine. We'd encourage you to do that in your classrooms too. There are some wonderful magazines. And a quick Google search will give you providers of an authentic educational resources that are designed for students at various ages and stages. There's some wonderful stuff to be found there. There are great websites like Phosphor, I've just mentioned, like Un Jour, Un Actu, that we've just that I use quite a lot as well. And those can be great for simple little stories, little sort of faits divers and things like that actually can really hook students' attention in the classroom as much as in an assessment.
Perfect. So yeah, I was going to say my knowledge here would extend to thinking Tricolore was an excellent book back in the day. Giving my age away quite drastically. And we've got so many good questions here. I'm just having a quick skim. How about, do you have any hints and tips for getting candidates used to being recorded for the oral? It's actually, that stage fright is a common problem.
It totally is. Lots of practice, I think, is the answer here, really. And we don't want to see this, of course, in many senses, the oral exam is, a culmination of everything they've been practicing up till that point. But again, encouraging the candidates to see it as an interaction with their teacher, where the examination element of it is sort of incidental, is what we'd recommend. Now, I know that sounds idealistic, and I know that there are candidates nonetheless who freeze and who find that really difficult, especially often we see at level 1. And in fact, I was literally just about to make the point that I think Mr. Turner has just made there in the comments. That was going to be the next thing I was going to say, which is not only practice, but as much practice as you can do that replicates the context in which they will actually sit that assessment is really important. Somebody suggested to me recently as well, which I think is a lovely idea, dressing up the microphone as, as a character or a puppet or whatever it might be, or even, as was the case for my Spanish GCSE oral, and I got really worried halfway through it, and hiding the microphone, which my teacher did. I realised it was under a piece of paper, but I realised about 15 minutes in that I couldn't see it, and then I sort of thought that he'd forgotten to start recording it, which then in turn, made me even more nervous than I might have been if it was there in front of me. But yeah, certainly, regular practice, regular exposure, and of course, if your students, if you are encouraging a communicative environment in class, where the students are happy and confident talking and conversing with each other, then I think it will fundamentally come more naturally. Don't forget too, and do say this to your candidates, there's nothing wrong with a little bit of exam nerves, right? In fact, some of that energy and that adrenaline can be really good for them. And we, as people listening to these tests, it happens to our own candidates at GCSE, at A-level, and so on. We know that this is a big deal for them. We're certainly never judging candidates who, for example, stutter, stammer, hesitate, have to repeat themselves, have to ask a question to be repeated. Please tell your candidates not to worry about that sort of thing. And we really are, interested in marking them positively, seeing what they're able to do, seeing how well they realise their potential.
Perfect. So what else are we... This is a good question. How strict should markers be when marking the level 2 grammar sentences?
This is a question we get asked a lot, understandably. The mark schemes that we provide always indicate where accent errors should be penalised. So that's a sort of red line. And often that's to do with accents that otherwise affect or that change the meaning of a particular word. So, for example, with or without a grave accent on in French. And sometimes, depending on how that's used or where that error happens, it's still, the communicative objective is still met, but sometimes it can be unclear. It is worth saying, to make it, I suppose, a relatively obvious point, that the full mark scheme exists for a reason. And certainly good candidates should be and are able to achieve full marks on those tasks, even whilst making some mistakes. This isn't solely a pursuit of absolute perfection. And it is possible, as I say, for candidates to score very well, even get full marks on those, whilst also, including a couple of errors.
Excellent. Well, I have just, unless any come in on the chat, a little bit of a prompt to do so, just one more actually remaining. Really interesting question here, because I wonder how much this comes up. Where senior schools require candidates to sit level 2 papers, what can we do for weaker candidates as an alternative to them not taking a language exam at all?
The sense of achievement that candidates get from sitting a formal qualification, and I think, again, it's not all about the qualification, but it is at least in part. That's partly why we're here today. Is really important, and it's something in many ways that your students sort of deserve. One thing that we've recommended, one thing that we've talked about amongst ourselves, has been to get weaker candidates, for example, to sit level 1 papers and mark them internally, such that they do feel that they have achieved, a benchmark of success in the language. And we would encourage, at the risk again of sounding too idealistic, we would encourage as many candidates as possible to try and access as much of our assessment portfolio as possible, because we do really make an effort as examiners, as people who write these papers, to ensure that there is, to ensure that questions are graded in difficulty, and that even candidates who do struggle with languages, and there are plenty out there, are nonetheless able to get some satisfaction out of and reward from being able to express themselves well.
Excellent. Well, with no other questions coming in as yet on the chat, I think I must say, I'm certain on behalf of all of us how brilliant it is. And for those of you that have not met William Law before, he does give good presentation, and I think you guys are going to really enjoy seeing him again in our June session. So just a reminder, I cannot say anything other than what Will's already told you. Hottest ticket in town for June. Do get onto Eventbrite and take advantage of what is ultimately a steal to get to see him once more. Now, the other thing that we absolutely must do is thank Winnie for her cameo appearance, which was fabulous. She is, I can tell all of you,
yes,
well, the most
sorry about that,
adorable puppet. Who must be forgiven upon sight. She's wonderful.
I'd had intended to do this from school, but alas, we had some internet problems. So I've been a working dad.
Well, if it's any help, last time when we did some CPD sessions, I have been guilty of the following crimes: Amazon knocking on the door, taking in things for other people, my children coming home unexpectedly, 2 of my giant dogs kicking off. So I think the beautiful Winnie making a cameo is just perfect. But thank you.
Let's hope it goes viral.
Yes. Oh God, yeah. Oh my goodness. But yeah, a huge thank you to you, Will. A huge thank you to everybody for tuning in and listening. We would love to, if you come to the next session, do send as many questions as you have this time beforehand, because we will make sure we address them. These sessions are meant to be for you. If you have any suggestions about things you'd like us to cover, again, please let us know. We want to be able to give you what you need to support you as teachers. But you know, it remains for me to say a huge thank you, Will. You are so... Oh, Mr. Turner wants to see the dog.
La prochaine fois.
Oh, next time. Oh my God.
There we go. You see,
you,
and that's the importance of consolidation, regular exposure, and practice. There we go.
Absolutely. You see, by being around Will, my French has improved. So next time, Mr. Turner and all of Winnie's Knee fans. But thank you so much, Will. Your enthusiasm, your brilliant teaching, your ability to communicate in a way that means that we've all got so much that we can apply in our own teaching and preparation for assessment is incredible. Thank you so much. And we
You're very welcome. Thank
you all again in June. Thank you, Will.
Absolutely.